On a freezing winter morning, a man's quiet solitude is shattered by a desperate struggle in the icy river. A golden retriever, barely clinging to life, drifts helplessly in the current. Without hesitation, he dives in, risking everything to save a stranger in need. What happens next will warm your heart and leave you in awe. But before we dive deeper into this story of courage and connection, let's explore how one act of kindness can change not just one life, but two. The river twisted through the forest like a cold silver ribbon, its surface rippling under the biting winter wind. Snow blanketed the landscape, muffling all sound except the occasional crack of ice and the distant cry of a bird. For most, the river was a source of life, but for the golden retriever struggling in its icy depths, it was an escape, a desperate leap toward freedom. The dog's golden fur was dull and patchy, marked by faint scars that told a story of suffering. Each stroke of its legs in the water grew weaker, its breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. It wasn't the freezing current that drained its strength, but the weight of a life spent enduring cruelty. For years, the dog had been trapped in a nightmare. Its owner, a man consumed by alcohol and rage, used fists and belts to enforce his will. The dog had cowered in corners, its tail tucked and heart pounding, as the man's booming voice signaled another outburst. Food was scarce, often nothing more than scraps tossed carelessly onto the filthy floor. Nights were cold, spent on a short chain outside, no matter the weather. One memory was etched more deeply than the others. The night of the worst beating. The man, drunk and stumbling, had lashed out after the dog accidentally tipped over an empty bottle. The belt had come down again and again, each strike a searing reminder of its helplessness. Blood mingled with its fur, tears welled in its eyes, and the world seemed to collapse into darkness. But even in its pain, the dog dreamed of escape, of a world beyond this misery, a place where it could run free without fear. That night had sparked something deep within. The next morning, while the man was passed out on the floor, the dog saw its chance. The front door had been left ajar, and without hesitation it bolted into the snow-covered forest. For hours it ran, its breath forming clouds in the freezing air, its paws stinging from the cold ground. The forest offered no warmth, but it promised something far greater: freedom. Eventually, the dog reached the river, its surface glinting faintly under the pale sun. The icy current was a gamble, but the dog had nothing left to lose. With a deep breath it plunged into the water. At first the cold was a shock, but adrenaline pushed the dog forward. Its legs churned, muscles burning as it fought the relentless current. For a fleeting moment, it felt alive, defying the river's pull. But freedom came at a cost. The frigid water sapped its strength, each stroke growing weaker than the last. The dog's head dipped below the surface before bobbing back up, its breaths ragged and desperate. As the river carried it further downstream, its movement slowed. Exhaustion claimed its body and the dog could only float, surrendering to the current. In that moment, it wasn't fear that filled its heart, but a quiet resignation. Perhaps this was better than returning to the life it had fled. On the riverbank, Mark sat quietly, his fishing rod resting against a nearby rock. The cabin he called home was just a short walk away, a refuge he had built for himself after the world became too cruel to bear. His days were spent in silence, the ache of loss his only companion. The faint movement on the water caught his eye. At first he dismissed it as debris, a piece of driftwood carried by the current. But then he saw it, a patch of golden fur, floating motionlessly downstream. His breath caught in his throat. A dog. Mark rose to his feet, his heart pounding as he watched the lifeless body approach. Memories surged forward, unbidden and painful. He had failed to save once before. He couldn't fail again. Without hesitation, Mark sprinted toward the riverbank, his boots crunching through the snow. The cold wind tore at his face, but he didn't care. Reaching the edge of the water, he didn't pause to think. He plunged into the freezing current, the cold slicing into his skin like knives. The river pushed against him, threatening to sweep him away, but Mark pressed forward. His eyes locked onto the dog, now just a few feet away. "Hold on," he muttered through chattering teeth, though he knew the dog couldn't hear him. Reaching out with trembling hands, he grasped the dog's sodden fur. It was heavier than he expected, its body limp and unresponsive. Fear gripped his chest, but he refused to let go. With a final surge of strength, Mark hauled the dog against his chest, shielding it from the current as he stumbled back toward the shore. When he finally reached the riverbank, his legs gave out beneath him and he collapsed onto the snow. The dog lay motionless in his arms, its fur matted and freezing to the touch. Mark pressed his fingers to its chest, searching desperately for any sign of life. And then he felt it. A faint, fragile rhythm. The dog was alive, but just barely. Mark cradled the dog closer, its body shivering violently in the icy air. "You're safe now," he whispered, though his words felt hollow against the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something neither of them could yet understand. A connection forged in desperation and bound by the shared pain of survival. The cabin stood quiet and still, nestled deep within the snowy forest. As Mark pushed open the heavy wooden door, a rush of warmth from the crackling fireplace greeted him, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. His soaked clothes clung to his body and his arms ached from carrying the lifeless weight of the dog. But he didn't stop. The dog's fragile breaths were a reminder that time was of the essence. Mark set the dog down gently on an old armchair near the fire, its frame sagging under the weight of years. The dog's fur was still damp and cold, clinging tightly to its lean, scarred body. Its golden coat, once bright and radiant, now seemed dulled by the hardships it had endured. Kneeling beside it, Mark grabbed a soft, worn blanket from a nearby shelf and wrapped it around the shivering creature. "You'll be okay," Mark murmured softly, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed his words. Mark's mind raced as he moved around the small cabin, gathering anything that might help. He heated a small pot of water on the wood-burning stove, adding a splash of milk to make it warm but not too hot. When the mixture was ready, he returned to the dog's side with a small spoon and carefully dripped a few drops onto its lips. The dog didn't react at first, its body too weak to respond. Mark sighed heavily, his fingers brushing gently over its damp fur. "Come on, buddy," he whispered, the name slipping out naturally. "You've made it this far. Don't give up now." Hours passed, the firelight casting flickering shadows across the room. Mark didn't leave Buddy's side, speaking to the dog in quiet tones. He told it stories, fragments of his life, moments of joy and sorrow that he hadn't shared with anyone since his wife's passing. "She always said I had a soft spot for strays." Mark chuckled weakly, his voice breaking. "Guess she was right." At one point Buddy stirred. A faint whimper escaped its lips and its eyelids fluttered open for a moment before closing again. Mark's heart leapt. It wasn't much, but it was a start. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the cabin's frosted windows, Buddy's breathing had grown stronger. Its chest rose and fell with a steady rhythm, and its body no longer trembled as violently. Mark watched intently as the dog shifted slightly, its head turning ever so slightly toward the warmth of the fire. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" Mark said softly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He offered the warm milk again, this time using his fingers to gently coax a few drops into Buddy's mouth. To his relief, the dog licked weakly at the liquid, its tongue barely visible as it tasted the warmth. Mark's chest tightened with a mix of relief and hope. Over the next few hours, Buddy's movements grew more deliberate. It tried to lift its head, though it wobbled and fell back onto the blanket. Mark chuckled softly, his voice filled with encouragement. "Take it easy, Buddy. There's no rush." As the day wore on, Buddy began to make small but meaningful progress. Its eyes, once dull and lifeless, now followed Mark as he moved around the cabin. The dog's ears twitched at the sound of Mark's voice and its tail gave the faintest wag when Mark returned to its side. "You're getting there," Mark said, reaching out to scratch behind Buddy's ears. The dog leaned into the touch, its eyes closing briefly in what could only be described as relief. The connection between them grew stronger with each passing hour. Mark found himself talking to Buddy as if the dog could understand every word. He told it about the wife he had lost, about the loneliness that had consumed him in the years since. Buddy listened in silence, its eyes full of quiet understanding. "I think we're going to be good for each other," Mark said one evening as he sat by the fire, Buddy resting at his feet. By the end of the week, Buddy had begun to move around the cabin on its own. Though its steps were unsteady and it still tired easily, the dog's spirit was unmistakable. It explored the small space cautiously, sniffing at the old furniture and wagging its tail at the faint scents of Mark's cooking. Mark couldn't help but smile as he watched Buddy reclaim its strength. The dog's recovery was more than just a physical triumph, it was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of care and compassion. One evening, as Buddy curled up beside the fire, Mark leaned back in his chair and let out a contented sigh. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty. "You've brought this place back to life, Buddy," Mark said, his voice soft but filled with gratitude. "Maybe we've both found what we needed." Buddy let out a quiet sigh, its golden coat glowing in the firelight. Its eyes met Mark's, and in that moment words weren't necessary. They had found solace in each other, a fragile yet unshakable bond that promised healing for both of their wounded hearts. Buddy's recovery was nothing short of remarkable. Within days, the once frail and lifeless dog had transformed into a lively and curious companion. Its golden coat regained its luster, catching the light of the cabin's fire as it bounded across the small living space. Mark couldn't help but smile as he watched Buddy rediscover the simple joys of life. The dog's energy seemed endless. Every morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the frosted windows, Buddy would trot to Mark's bedside, its tail wagging enthusiastically. A soft bark or gentle nudge of its wet nose was all it took to rouse Mark from his sleep. All right, Mark would chuckle, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. I get it, you're ready for the day. Buddy quickly became Mark's shadow, following him everywhere he went. Whether it was fetching firewood from the shed or stacking logs for the hearth, Buddy was always close by, its tail wagging like a metronome. Mark would chuckle as the dog tried to carry small pieces of wood in its mouth, often dropping them along the way. You've got the spirit, Mark said one day as Buddy proudly deposited a stick at his feet. Not exactly the help I was looking for, but I'll take it. The cabin, once quiet and filled only with Mark's thoughts, was now alive with the sound of Buddy's playful antics. The dog would chase after falling leaves outside, pounce on shadows in the sunlight, and occasionally bring Mark small gifts from the forest, a pine cone, a stray twig, even a worn glove it had somehow unearthed from the snow. Mark began taking Buddy on long walks through the forest, something he hadn't done since his wife passed. At first the idea of venturing far from the cabin had felt burdensome, but Buddy's excitement was infectious. Together, they explored the winding trails that snaked through the trees, Buddy darting ahead to sniff out scents and then circling back to ensure Mark was following. Mark marveled at how Buddy seemed to find joy in everything. The crunch of snow under its paws, the whisper of wind through the trees, the distant call of an owl. For the first time in years, Mark found himself smiling, not just at Buddy, but at the world around him. You're something else, you know that? Mark said one afternoon as they rested by a frozen stream. Buddy sat at his feet, its head tilted in that curious way dogs do, as if trying to understand his words. I haven't felt this alive in, I can't even remember how long. Buddy's presence wasn't just a source of joy, it also brought Mark a sense of purpose. The dog's needs gave structure to Mark's days, breaking the monotony that had once consumed him. Feeding Buddy, brushing its coat, and simply spending time with it became rituals that Mark cherished. When Mark worked in his small workshop, crafting simple furniture or fixing tools, Buddy would lie nearby, its head resting on its paws as it watched him work. The quiet companionship was soothing, filling the cabin with a sense of warmth that had been missing for far too long. At night, Buddy would curl up on a blanket near the fire, its soft snores a comforting backdrop to Mark's thoughts. Sometimes, Mark would reach down and run his fingers through the dog's fur, finding solace in its steady presence. As weeks turned into months, the bond between Mark and Buddy grew unshakable. Mark found himself talking to the dog as if it were a close friend, sharing stories about his past and dreams for the future. Buddy, in turn, responded with its unwavering loyalty, always listening, always present. One chilly evening, as the snow fell gently outside, Mark sat in his armchair with a mug of tea in hand. Buddy lay at his feet, its tail thumping softly against the floor. You've changed things around here, Buddy, Mark said, his voice tinged with gratitude. I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again, but you've brought something back. Hope maybe? Or maybe just the reminder that I'm not alone. Buddy lifted its head, its warm brown eyes meeting Mark's. The connection between them needed no words. It was a bond forged in mutual healing, a partnership that had brought life back into both their worlds. From chopping wood to exploring the forest trails, Buddy became more than just a dog, he became Mark's partner in every sense of the word. The cabin, once a place of quiet solitude, was now filled with laughter, movement, and a renewed sense of purpose. Mark no longer counted the days in silence. He measured them in the wag of Buddy's tail, the sound of its playful bark, and the warmth of its companionship. Together, they had carved out a new chapter, one filled with the kind of joy and connection that neither of them had thought possible. As Mark watched Buddy chase a flurry of snowflakes outside the cabin one afternoon, he smiled. Life had changed, and for the first time in a long while, it was a change he welcomed. The wind howled through the forest like a living, breathing beast, rattling the windows of Mark's cabin. The fire in the hearth flickered and hissed as gusts of icy air found their way through tiny cracks in the walls. Outside the storm raged, snow falling in thick sheets that blanketed the world in a suffocating silence. Mark sat by the fire, a mug of steaming tea warming his hands, while Buddy lay curled up on his blanket near the hearth. The dog's golden coat shimmered in the firelight, and his soft snores brought a sense of comfort despite the chaos outside. Mark glanced at the storm through the frosted window, grateful to be inside, safe and warm. But the peace didn't last. A faint rustling sound outside caught Buddy's attention. His ears perked up, and his nose twitched as he lifted his head. Mark noticed the change immediately. "What is it, boy?" Mark asked, setting his mug down. Buddy let out a low, curious whine before leaping to his feet. His tail wagged slightly as he moved toward the door, his eyes fixed on something unseen in the darkness beyond. Then without warning, Buddy barked sharply and darted toward the door, scratching at it frantically. Mark frowned. "Buddy, no, it's too dangerous out there." But before he could stop him, Buddy let out another bark and bolted out the door, the storm swallowing him instantly. Mark stood frozen for a moment, the door swinging open as snow and wind rushed inside. His heart pounded in his chest. "Buddy!" he shouted into the storm, but his voice was lost in the howling wind. Grabbing his coat and flashlight, Mark rushed out into the blizzard. The cold hit him like a wall, piercing through his layers and stealing his breath. Snow whipped around him, reducing visibility to mere feet. "Buddy!" he called again, his voice cracking with worry. He followed the faint paw prints in the snow, but the storm quickly began to cover them. Mark trudged forward, his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the blinding whiteness. Each step was a struggle, the snow dragging at his boots and the wind threatening to knock him off balance. "Buddy!" he shouted again, his voice growing hoarse. Minutes turned into hours as Mark searched, his desperation mounting with each passing moment. The thought of losing Buddy, of being alone again, was unbearable. His mind raced with fears. What if Buddy was injured? What if he had strayed too far? Meanwhile, Buddy was fighting his own battle. After chasing a squirrel into the woods, his playful instincts had quickly turned into a terrifying ordeal. The snow had grown deeper, and the scents he had been following vanished beneath the storm. Disoriented and cold, Buddy pressed on, his golden fur now coated in snow and ice. In his panic, Buddy stumbled into a dense thicket of thorny bushes. The sharp branches snagged his fur and dug into his skin, pinning his leg painfully. He let out a yelp, struggling to free himself, but the more he moved, the tighter the thorns gripped him. Buddy whimpered softly, his breath shallow and labored. Despite the pain and cold, he lifted his head and let out a series of barks, hoping that Mark would hear him. Mark's flashlight flickered as the batteries began to weaken, but he refused to turn back. His hands were numb and his legs ached from trudging through the snow. Then faintly, he heard it. A bark, weak but unmistakable. "Buddy!" he shouted, his voice breaking with relief. He followed the sound, his pace quickening despite the exhaustion. When he finally found Buddy, tangled in the thicket, Mark's heart clenched at the sight. The dog's leg was trapped, and small cuts marred his golden coat, some bleeding faintly. Buddy's eyes, filled with pain, lit up when he saw Mark. Despite his condition, the dog wagged his tail weakly, a silent assurance that he had been waiting, trusting that Mark would come. "I've got you, boy," Mark said, his voice shaking as he knelt beside Buddy. He carefully worked to free the dog, his fingers trembling from both the cold and the fear that he might hurt him further. Buddy whimpered softly but didn't resist, his trust in Mark absolute. Finally, with a sharp snap, the last of the thorny branches gave way. Mark scooped Buddy into his arms, holding him close against his chest to shield him from the storm. "Hang in there, Buddy. We're going home," Mark whispered, his voice filled with determination. The journey back to the cabin was grueling. The storm showed no mercy and Mark's strength was waning. But he kept moving, driven by the warmth of Buddy's body against his and the quiet whimpers that reminded him why he couldn't stop. When they finally reached the cabin, Mark pushed the door open with his shoulder and stumbled inside. The warmth of the fire was a welcome relief and Mark wasted no time. He gently set Buddy down on his blanket near the hearth and began cleaning the cuts on the dog's leg with trembling hands. "You're a tough one, aren't you?" Mark said softly, his voice tinged with both exhaustion and pride. Buddy's eyes never left Mark's face, his trust unwavering despite the ordeal. As Mark finished bandaging the wounds, Buddy let out a quiet sigh and rested his head on Mark's knee. "You scared me, you know," Mark said, stroking Buddy's fur gently. "Don't ever do that again." Buddy responded with a soft thump of his tail, a silent promise to stay by Mark's side. That night, as the storm continued to rage outside, the cabin felt like a sanctuary. Mark sat by the fire, Buddy curled up beside him, and for the first time in years, he felt something he thought he had lost: family. The bond between them had deepened, forged through shared trials and unwavering trust. Mark knew, without a doubt, that they had saved each other in more ways than one. The morning after the storm, the forest lay still, blanketed in a fresh coat of snow that sparkled under the pale winter sun. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire crackled softly, and the faint smell of tea wafted through the air. Buddy lay on his blanket near the hearth, his bandaged legs stretched out while Mark sat beside him, carefully inspecting the wounds. "You're lucky, you know that?" Mark said softly, his voice tinged with both relief and scolding. "Chasing squirrels in the middle of a blizzard, what were you thinking?" Buddy lifted his head, his soft brown eyes meeting Mark's, filled with an expression that seemed almost apologetic. A faint wag of his tail brushed against the floor, as if to reassure Mark that he was still there, still grateful. Mark sighed, a small smile breaking across his face. "Yeah, I forgive you," he murmured, running his hand gently over Buddy's golden fur. For the next several days, Mark devoted himself to Buddy's recovery. He cleaned the dog's wounds with meticulous care, changing the bandages and ensuring there were no signs of infection. The once routine quiet of the cabin was now filled with Buddy's soft whines of discomfort and Mark's soothing reassurances. Each day, Buddy grew stronger. His limp became less pronounced, and his tail wagged more frequently. He followed Mark around the cabin, leaning against him for support when he was too tired to walk far. At night, Buddy would settle beside Mark's chair, resting his head on Mark's foot as the firelight flickered across the room. Mark often found himself talking to Buddy, sharing stories and thoughts he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "She would have liked you," Mark said one evening, staring into the fire. His voice was quiet, but his words carried the weight of memory. "My wife, I mean. She had a soft spot for creatures like you. Always said the world needed more people who could see the good in things." Buddy let out a soft huff, his eyes closing as if he understood. Buddy's presence in the cabin was more than just comforting. It was transformative. The once lifeless space now felt warm and alive, filled with the sounds of movement and companionship. Mark found himself looking forward to each day, his routine no longer dictated by loneliness but by the simple joy of having Buddy by his side. Even the smallest tasks, like chopping firewood or preparing meals, felt lighter with Buddy watching from nearby. The dog's quiet loyalty and unspoken understanding gave Mark a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since his wife's passing. One snowy afternoon, as Mark worked on repairing a broken chair, Buddy limped over and sat beside him, watching intently. Mark chuckled, setting down his tools to scratch behind Buddy's ears. "What do you think, Buddy? Does it pass your inspection?" Buddy responded with a wag of his tail and a soft bark, earning a laugh from Mark. Mark often marveled at the transformation in Buddy. The dog, once scarred and fragile, now carried himself with quiet confidence. His golden coat shone in the firelight, and his eyes sparkled with life. But it wasn't just Buddy who had changed. Mark felt it too. For so long, the weight of loss had consumed him, leaving him numb to the world. But Buddy had broken through that darkness, bringing with him a reminder of what it meant to care, to hope and to love. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Mark leaned back in his chair and looked down at Buddy, who was curled up at his feet. "You've saved me, you know," he said softly. "I thought I'd lost everything worth living for, but you've shown me there's still something to fight for." Buddy's tail thumped softly against the floor in response, his eyes half closed in contentment. With Buddy's recovery nearly complete, the two settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. They spent their days exploring the forest, gathering firewood, or simply sitting by the river, watching the water flow. Mark no longer felt the heavy ache of loneliness that had once defined his days. Instead, he felt a quiet gratitude, for the companionship of a loyal dog and for the second chance they had given each other. The cabin, once a place of solitude, now felt like a home again. Laughter and warmth filled the space, and even the long cold nights seemed brighter with Buddy by his side. As they sat together by the fire one evening, Mark reached down to rest his hand on Buddy's head. "I don't know what I did to deserve you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm glad you're here." Buddy nuzzled against Mark's hand, his trust and love evident in every movement. In their shared moments of quiet understanding, Mark and Buddy had found what they both needed most, a reason to keep going, and the strength to face whatever lay ahead. Winter's icy grip on the forest began to loosen as the first hints of spring appeared. The snowbanks shrank, and the forest trails that Mark and Buddy had traversed countless times now revealed patches of soft earth beneath their feet. For the first time in years, Mark felt a sense of renewal, as if the changing seasons mirrored the transformation in his own life. Buddy's recovery and newfound vitality had not gone unnoticed. Word of the remarkable bond between the reclusive woodsman and his loyal golden retriever began to spread beyond the quiet forest. It started with a chance encounter one morning when Mark and Buddy ventured into the nearby village for supplies. Buddy, always curious and friendly, drew immediate attention as he trotted beside Mark, his golden coat gleaming in the sunlight. Children, wide-eyed with excitement, gathered around, eager to pet the dog. "Is he yours?" one little boy asked, his hand hesitating before touching Buddy's fur. Mark nodded with a small smile. "His name's Buddy." The boy giggled as Buddy wagged his tail and licked his hand. Soon a group of children had surrounded Buddy, laughing as he happily wagged his tail and let them pet him. Their joy was infectious, and for the first time in years, Mark found himself laughing along with them. Word of Buddy's story traveled quickly through the village. People were captivated by the tale of how Mark had rescued the dog during a storm and how they had saved each other from loneliness. The story spread from house to house, each retelling adding a little more warmth and wonder. Buddy quickly became a beloved figure in the village. Children adored him, often running up to greet him whenever Mark brought him into town. Even the adults, initially hesitant to approach the quiet woodsman, softened when they saw how Buddy interacted with the children. "Mark," an elderly woman said one day, her voice filled with warmth, "you've got a remarkable dog there. He brings so much joy to the kids." Mark, though unaccustomed to praise, simply nodded and smiled. "He's pretty special," he admitted, patting Buddy's head. Buddy's presence began to have a ripple effect. Families, inspired by the story of his rescue, started to look at their own pets differently, appreciating their companionship in ways they hadn't before. A few even adopted stray dogs from the village shelter, moved by Mark and Buddy's bond. The story didn't stop in the village. A journalist visiting the area heard about Mark and Buddy's journey and wrote an article that was published in a regional newspaper. Before long, letters began arriving at Mark's cabin, sent from people who had read the story. One letter, written in neat cursive, read, "Dear Mark, I read about you and Buddy in the paper, and your story brought tears to my eyes. It reminded me of a dog I had as a child, who was my best friend during difficult times. Thank you for sharing your story. It gives me hope that love and kindness can still thrive in this world. Sincerely, Emily." Another letter came from a man who had recently lost his wife and adopted a rescue dog after being inspired by Mark and Buddy's bond. Mark was overwhelmed by the outpouring of kindness. Each letter felt like a thread connecting him to people he had never met, reminding him that his life, once so isolated, now had meaning that extended far beyond the forest. Buddy, of course, took the newfound attention in stride. He greeted everyone with the same boundless enthusiasm, his tail wagging and his golden fur shining. Whether he was playing with children, greeting the village elders, or sitting patiently by Mark's side, Buddy exuded a warmth that touched everyone he encountered. Mark, once reluctant to leave his cabin, now found himself looking forward to their visits to the village. He saw how Buddy brought people together. How the dog's story inspired kindness and compassion. And in turn, he began to feel a quiet sense of pride, not just in Buddy, but in the journey they had shared. One afternoon, as Mark sat on the cabin porch with Buddy lying at his feet, he sifted through a small pile of letters. He read each one carefully, his heart swelling with gratitude. These letters were more than just words on a page. They were proof that their story had mattered, that it had made a difference. Mark looked down at Buddy, who glanced up with a gentle wag of his tail. "You've done more than I ever could have imagined," Mark said softly. "You've brought people together, reminded them of what's important." Buddy responded with a soft huff, as if to say, "We did it together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the forest in hues of gold and orange, Mark felt a deep sense of peace. The cabin, once a place of solitude, had become a home filled with love, not just between him and Buddy, but extending to the people who had been touched by their story. The seasons shifted, as they always did, but life in the cabin remained a sanctuary for both Mark and Buddy. The snow melted into streams that danced through the forest. The earth awakened with fresh blooms, and the warmth of spring sunlight streamed through the cabin's windows. For Mark, each day felt like a gift, no longer a burden to endure but an opportunity to cherish. Buddy had become a part of his life in ways he could never have anticipated. The dog's playful energy, unwavering loyalty and gentle spirit filled every corner of the cabin with a sense of peace and purpose. Whether they were walking through the woods, chopping firewood, or simply sitting together by the fire, Buddy's presence was a constant source of comfort. One evening, Mark sat in his armchair, a mug of tea warming his hands as the fire crackled beside him. Buddy lay on the rug, his golden coat glowing in the firelight, his tail wagging lazily as Mark spoke. "You've taught me a lot, you know," Mark said, his voice soft but steady. "About second chances, about what it means to keep going even when things feel impossible." Buddy lifted his head, his soulful brown eyes meeting Mark's, and let out a soft huff as if to say, "I know." Mark chuckled, reaching down to scratch behind Buddy's ears. "I thought I was saving you that day in the river," he continued. "But the truth is, you saved me just as much." Mark often reflected on how much his life had changed since Buddy's arrival. The dog had been more than just a companion. He had been a symbol of hope, a reminder that even the most broken hearts could heal. In saving Buddy, Mark had found the strength to face his own pain, to let go of the past, and to embrace the beauty of the present. The cabin, once a place of solitude and sorrow, had become a home filled with warmth and love. Buddy's playful antics, his quiet presence, and his boundless loyalty had transformed Mark's world. One Sunday morning, as the sunlight streamed through the forest canopy, Mark took Buddy to the edge of the river, where they had first met. The water flowed gently now, a stark contrast to the icy torrent of that fateful day. Mark knelt down, running his fingers through Buddy's fur. "This is where it all started, huh?" he said, his voice tinged with wonder. "Funny how life works. Sometimes, the things we think are accidents turn out to be the best blessings of all." Buddy wagged his tail and nudged Mark's hand with his nose, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey. As Mark stood, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not just for Buddy, but for the lessons their time together had taught him. He realized that saving Buddy hadn't been a random act of kindness. It had been a divine opportunity to rediscover love, hope, and the power of connection. As Mark and Buddy's story comes to a close, we are reminded of the profound impact even the smallest acts of kindness can have. In saving a life, Mark found the strength to heal his own heart. Buddy, in turn, became a beacon of hope, showing us that love and loyalty can transform even the darkest of days. Let this story inspire you to look for the blessings in your own life and to never underestimate the power of compassion. Perhaps you've experienced a bond like Mark and Buddy's or know someone who has. We'd love to hear your thoughts and stories. Please share them in the comments below. If this tale has touched your heart, consider sharing it with others. By spreading stories of hope and love, we can remind the world of the beauty in small, selfless acts. And before we go, let's take a moment to reflect. Dear Lord, thank you for the miracles you place in our lives, both big and small. Bless everyone reading this story with hope, compassion, and the courage to face each day with love. May we always find the strength to save, to heal, and to cherish the gifts you've given us. Amen. Don't forget to like, comment, and share this story with someone who needs a little hope today. Together, we can spread kindness, one story at a time. God bless you.